Good afternoon. Welcome to Family Matters with Reese Law. We are a family law firm based in Fairfax with an office in Prince William County and serve the Northern Virginia, Maryland, and DC areas. In episode 20 of our podcast, we will be talking to the author of the book, Listen. That would be Jen Dalton, founder and CEO of BrandMirror, certified personal brand strategist for executives and entrepreneurs. Today, we are going to be discussing why it is important to have quality conversations, not just during the holidays, but year round. Hi, Jen. Thank you for being our guest today on Family Matters with Reese Law and sharing your knowledge of communications.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to hear you talk to us about the book. I have given it a read. And in the book, Listen, you address difficult conversations when people are heavily invested in the outcome. And as a family law attorney, this skill is one to be mastered. What brought you to this topic?
So it's interesting that we're just in the midterm season because 2018, we were in midterm season at that time. And I remember sitting on my couch with a cup of coffee and I was very calm. And my husband said something political, and I'm quite liberal and he's quite conservative, although for most things we see eye to eye. He said something and it just irked me so much that I had a visceral, physical, tension building up. And we've been married 20 years, right? And I'm thinking, why am I overreacting? What is going on here? Because I love my husband. He loves me. This is crazy. So I started to research difficult conversations, especially with politics in mind. And then as I started to do research, I realized, yes, I am good at communications, but difficult conversations are a whole nother level. And so I interviewed 30 people for my book and asked each of them, what is the most difficult conversation you've had? And then started to gather insights and lessons learned and best practices. And so every chapter in the book is a different topic. And it really gave me space to create structure for how do you begin, at least start down the path of having a difficult conversation, because avoiding them is really not the right answer.
No, it tends to get you nowhere or to a place that you don't want to be. And one of the things that I really like about your book is the chapter delineations, because it addresses how to talk to young people, how to talk to older people, how to talk to employers, how to talk with spouses. So it's like a workbook. It's very organized to give people direction in the right way to go about things, because every relationship is different. So,
absolutely.
Did you encounter people that were experiencing fear or catastrophizing about the conversation they needed to have? Sometimes people get really worked up before they even know, but they assume the worst.
I do think that people have a negativity bias. So we are already having the conversation in our head and it goes terribly. And we haven't even had it yet. And so for the people that I interviewed, there was definitely a lot of fear and concern. Some topics were more difficult than others. One of the ones that was the most heated over time was politics at Thanksgiving. But there were others that were really complex, like a father coming out and having to talk to his family and children after a divorce about that. A family going through divorce, and how do you speak to your children about it? Then there are also business situations too, like how do you negotiate, especially if you're female trying to increase your pay, but maybe you're a work from home mom. How does that factor into it? So there were things where there was obvious fear. There were things where people have to talk to their parents about aging and moving them into a facility to help take care of them. And that's really hard because most of these difficult conversations have to do with our identity, who we are, what it means. And that's, I think, why some of these conversations are so difficult, because it's not necessarily a topic that's the real issue. It's when we have this conversation, what am I going to learn about myself? What am I going to learn about other people? And am I going to be comfortable with what I learn?
Because sometimes the good, bad, and the ugly all show up in one of these intense and intimate conversations. And it's true, it can be a non-intimate relationship as well, but the stakes can be very, very high, like talking with your boss, with
Absolutely.
regard to life changes that may require job changes for you. So, um, well, it sounds like you hit a pretty thorough group when you went out for the 30 to interview. I'd like you to take us through how one can prepare for a difficult conversation.
I'll share what I learned through the interviews and also what I learned while I had difficult conversations while I was writing the book, because none of us are experts at this. I think one of the biggest things I learned is, we all suffer from some type of I must get this done quickly or I'm not going to do it, right? That's sort of how you approach a difficult conversation. And most people avoid them. But for the people who do go to have them, they don't necessarily prepare in advance and think about what is success, right? So if you know it's going to be a heated conversation, is your goal, I just want to get through the conversation without freaking out? Or, if your goal is, I'm going to prove them wrong and I'm going to prove I'm right. If that's your goal, then you've already lost, is my sort of opinion after doing all of this research. I also think, yeah. And when we go into a conversation, whether you're in court, whether you're with a family, whether you're with friends, it's also thinking about what makes you mad. So you have to know your own triggers, and you have to also know what might trigger the people I'm speaking with, so that you either manage to that, right? If you're going to get stressed out, do you take a deep breath? Do you ask a question? Like, what's your strategy for managing that? Because the chances are someone's going to be upset. That's why you've been avoiding it, or that's why you think it's going to be difficult. The other thing, two things that I would say really changed my approach, and these were hard for me. One is to listen without judgment and to be open to the idea of what if I'm wrong about whatever the situation was. And it could be I didn't have all the information. It could be I was actually wrong. And I really try not to be wrong. And so that was a really irksome point. But it's really important, because if we aren't open to being wrong, we're also not open to learning. And that's why you go into a conversation, in my opinion, is to learn, not to win. That might be an outcome for a courtroom, but for a relationship, for your family, with your child, with your friend, hopefully the goal is I want to protect the relationship, and we also need to have this conversation. I think the book that I read that really gave great examples of this last insight was Leadership and Self-Deception. And it talks about how you need to see a person and not a problem. So oftentimes when we go into a conversation, we might see a person as our obstacle. And can't they just do this? Why don't they just do what I want? And if we see them as a problem or an obstacle or a thing, right? Someone in our way, blocking our way, and we don't think of them as a human still, then we lose the ability to have empathy and to really try to understand what's their point of view. Because we're just very sure that they have wronged us, that they're keeping us from success, it's their fault, and all of a sudden, that makes it very hard to move forward at all if you're just thinking about them as an obstacle. So those are, I think, some of the key best practices. I do think things like location, things like timing, when are you having the conversation, where, all of those things do matter. If people are already stressed, maybe you want to hold off on having the conversation, right? So it's just being mindful of what could increase your odds of success.
Right. And in my line of work, one thing that I'm constantly discussing with people, whether I'm preparing them for court or simply talking with them about what's coming up in their case, the word allow. I never want to hear it out of a client's mouth. I will allow you to have our son for this amount of time. That is a conversation stopper for the other side. And the other big one is my child.
Yes, sure.
Judges hear that loud and clear and think, okay, I think I know what part of the problem is. But people make assumptions. And so the learning part of the conversation is critical, because it can be okay to be wrong because you've gotten new information,
Mm-hmm.
and not have it always has to be a win or has to be a loss. Somebody has to lose. Both people lose if they're not capable of having the conversation. So some training is involved sometimes to try to get people to understand what the other person might be hearing. So,
And I do think that's a huge part of it. I mean, even with my husband, I've learned that if he says something, he uses different words than I do. And everybody does, right? We all use different words to say different things. And so I'll stop and say, okay, here's what I heard you say. Here's how it made me feel. I know you weren't trying to make me feel that way. Would you mind using different words to convey what you just said? Or, this is what I think you meant. Let me play it back to you. Is that what you meant? Right? It's okay to pause and clarify and not just start to get upset about, why, I can't believe you said that. Why did you say that? I mean, we know that the person, hopefully, that's closest to us, if they say something and it's an initial comment, they probably weren't trying to do something bad. The words might have just come out wrong. And so that's where the seek to learn, right, without judgment. I think that's huge. The other thing I would say is to practice your difficult conversations. And just like you were saying, you work with people and train families and talk through them. Sometimes when people break bad news as a difficult conversation, you want to have practice that scenario first. I remember after my mother passed away, my dad, I'd been talking to my dad and I knew he was sort of seeing people. And my husband said, what are you going to do when he goes to get married? And I'm like, what are you talking about? It's entirely too soon. What do you mean? And I had my little blow up then, because a month later, it might have even been only like 2 weeks later, I was talking to my father and I was saying, hey, how are things going? By the way, if you do decide you want to get remarried, I'm here to support you. And he goes, well, actually, I got engaged yesterday. And I was like, oh, okay. And luckily, I'd already had that sort of outburst with my husband, because I do think we're going to have a reaction. So if you can do some scenario planning or practice that, or do the worst case scenario, and then you at least have thought about it, so it's not a total surprise, so you can practice. I think that's a huge, huge asset. Because you don't want the first time you start a difficult conversation to be the first time you're saying something or reacting to something. You really do want to, if you can, role play or even just practice saying it out loud, so that you've at least given yourself a fair shot at saying something you won't regret later.
right. Because you might just go to word choices that are not going to be received well, but they're part of your natural lingo or with that person. But this is serious and you really want them to pay attention. So you've got to give them something to listen to that they can accept. It seems to be the overall theme of the book. And as I said, I love the fact that there's chapters that delineate ages and issues. If we talk about areas of life, where do you see it being the hardest for people to vulnerably communicate?
I do think parent-child relationships are really challenging. I think if you're a child who's become the parent and now you're parenting your parents, that's very hard. And it's challenging because you may, obviously, hopefully you want the best for them. They're also human, but we usually don't, depending on your parent, we're used to them telling us what to do. It's a really big role shift when you have to help guide them, because I've also found telling your parents really doesn't work that great. So how do you give them space to still be who they are and yet have those conversations? I think with children too, because you care so much about your children. And, one of the chapters is about divorce and how was that communicated to the children. And I was, having not gone through that, it was a really eye-opening experience to hear someone talk about how they were very careful to communicate with one child by themselves because they process information differently. They have different ways to discuss things, think about things, but give them a safe space. And then they had a conversation with the other child, give them a safe space, let them, and communicate it differently to them too, because of how they receive information. And so some parents, I'm sure, might say, let's sit down at the table and have this discussion as a family. We have some news. But I think there's a lot of power in knowing your family dynamic, knowing your kids, and when do you want to sit them down individually versus together. I'm sure you must see this all the time. But I thought, there were some really interesting ways that communication was managed that I've never experienced, which is why I wanted to include it in the book, so that if people read a chapter, they at least get an example of a conversation and how it went. So they're not totally surprised without any insight about how it might go.
Right. I do think that is really helpful. If you were to tell people the don'ts of these crucial conversations, what would you share?
I think it's very important to remember that people do things for themselves. They aren't necessarily doing them to you, although it may feel that way. And so sometimes people can say things that are intended to hurt you personally, but sometimes they're saying something and it's really not about you, it's about them and what they're going through. For me, that's helped to delineate when someone says something and it hurts, that it's not necessarily because they're trying to hurt me, they're trying to protect themselves. So I think that's one important thing, is to be able to step back and continue to have empathy and think about, what is this person going through that made them have to say it in this way, that yes, it hurt me so much. And I need to understand they're hurting too, and what can we do to move forward? The other thing that surprised me, and this was part of why in the very beginning when I was talking with my husband about politics, I didn't realize that there's a part of the brain that is all about collaboration, problem solving. But when you're in fight or flight mode, you are in a different part of the brain. It's not the part of the brain for collaboration. And so what's important is to recognize that if you feel stressed, you're not going to be in a place to collaborate, period. Your brain literally cannot function that way. There are two things you can do: listen and breathe. And breathing disrupts that part of your brain that lets you potentially get back to being able to collaborate. And so I'd say don't continue to yell at someone or argue, because you and they are both in a fight or flight mode. You're not in a place where you can collaborate. And so it's very important to press pause as soon as you need to and say, look, I care about this relationship. If we continue to get on this path, we're not going to be in any better place. It's okay to press pause. The other thing, and this was a big one for me too, don't assume that what you think is very obvious to your audience. We all think differently, communicate differently. And so I think it's important to recognize that when you're speaking with someone, to really be able to say something specific. For example, if we're talking about politics, I might start off by saying, I'm not here to change your mind. And normally we wouldn't start off a conversation like that, because most people go to a conversation to win, especially political stuff, because it's like, of course I'm right. Why didn't you vote for these people? These people are crazy. I mean, both sides say that about the other side. So when you go into a conversation, you say, I'm not here to change your mind. I care about our relationship more than the topic. I'm just here to learn. It keeps us out of that fight or flight mode. So don't be afraid to say exactly what you're trying to do, even if you don't get the words just right. Take a moment to really think about, what can I share? And what can I say in a way that will just make it more transparent of what you're trying to do? So those are a couple of things that I think are really important for people to think about, that they don't have to stay in a conversation that's not going well. You can exit that conversation, right? Even if you've scheduled an hour meeting with a spouse or a partner or a child or whatever, business partner, if it's going sideways, you can press stop right? You can set the ground rules. So don't be afraid to set the ground rules either. Like, we will talk with respect. If we can't do that, the conversation's over and we'll come back when we can. No hard feelings, because this is a emotional time. So I'd love to hear what some of yours are, because I it's a whole different world, but those are some I would recommend.
It is. And I've got the master's in counseling, but I've been working with mental health professionals throughout my 25-year career as a family law attorney. And the pausing and actually saying, I'd like to have a conversation with you about X. Can we do that? And, a few hours forward at 3:00. And while that's a pause, it gives the other person a bit of an opportunity to prepare for the conversation. And the other person can be working on listening, or the other thing I teach all the time is breathing. Because when people get stressed, the first thing they do is they start holding their breath, which causes them to get more anxious, and it makes the conversation more difficult. But the pause is really, really useful. And if the other person rejects the pause, they're rejecting having the opportunity to have the conversation. And if it's important, then perhaps you frame it a different way, like, let's go to dinner tomorrow night, just the two of us, and you plan on having that conversation at that time. But don't abandon it. If it's important to you, find a way to reframe it so that it works, especially if you're trying to talk about your relationship or something specific about your children. You don't want an audience for that anyway. But you do need a partner who's going to be open to listening to you. And the same thing goes for, business situations. Sometimes you're just blindsided by somebody saying, I want to talk to you about, you becoming vice president next week. Excuse me? Can we talk at 4 or some other, not that exact second in time, even though they may be ramped up about it, doesn't mean that you have to join them in being ramped up about it. That may make the conversation generally less effective.
Absolutely. Well, and I love that point. One of the things I'll say, if it's not the right time, because I don't have enough time, I will tell someone, this conversation is really important. I want to dedicate more time so we can talk through things. Do you mind if we talk at 4? This is clearly urgent to you. It's urgent to me. I just want to respect it and give it the space it needs, right? Sometimes we need to clarify those words, because if we said, I can't meet right now, or, we have to talk later, your audience, the person you're speaking with, might think they don't care, they don't get it, it's not urgent to them. And that's why I think giving people those extra words is helpful. Acknowledge that what they are feeling is relevant and matters, and then schedule the appropriate time to talk. The other, I have a question for you, because this came up a lot. I think for people who are nice and often want to help, we might have people come to us and say, hey, so would you mind talking to so-and-so about such and such? And one thing I really internalized and learned through the research is, do not be the messenger of a conversation that's not yours. And I think that oftentimes people are more than happy to have their difficult conversation outsourced. And I've had to tell some people, since I've written the book, not many, but a handful, around, gosh, I'm really glad you trust me enough to go have this conversation on your behalf. However, it's not my conversation. It's your conversation to have. More than happy to practice with you, but I'm not going to be the messenger, because we know what happens to the messenger, and it's not good. Do you see that? I mean, what's that like with you?
Well, I'll get calls from family members who want to tell me their whole version of the story of their child's marriage or something, and I'll make some notes, but I will not raise anything that they have said to me when I actually meet with the potential client. I want to hear what the client has to say about it, because the person I told might have only heard about the worst things, the days that person was frustrated and said, oh, I can't believe they did X. So I just go with what the client has to say. And, as there might be some cross-reference between what the other person told me, but, they're advocating, and they're advocating for a third party. And they usually have some degree of an interest, even just, I love my friend. I want to protect my friend.
Right.
It's your friend will be protected by coming to have a meeting with us. It'll be confidential conversation, but I really need their take, and nobody else can give that to me except them. So, and I just would love to talk with them, give them my information, and we'll get something set up. And that's pretty much where I leave it. And I do always tell the client, because they have a right to know, oh, thank you for coming to see me. Your friend so-and-so reached out, and we chatted for a moment or two, and they will usually say, so you know everything. I was like, no, I just, it was a very brief conversation, and I really need to hear from you. What's going on? So that person might be a witness, that third party might be a witness someday, but they're not the client. They are not the person who's really got the vested interest. And that's who I need to talk to. So they're going to be a decision maker in the process. So that's usually the path.
Well, and I think as one approaches learning in a conversation, the other thing that is important, and I'm sure you see this as you're doing research and learning, people's explanation or articulation of an event or perception they have is often shaped, if not entirely, pretty much entirely, by their experiences in life. And a lot of difficult conversations, I think, result because people make assumptions based on our experiences, based on how we like to be communicated with, on what other people's experiences are, and how they like to be communicated with. And oftentimes rarely are they the same. And so asking questions, right? Seeking to understand, tell me more about, why does this phrase make you upset? Well, my dad used to say that to me all the time, and it really, makes me angry. You never know until you ask. And even, from a political standpoint, right? We have Thanksgiving coming up, politics is always something people talk about, argue about. We don't know people's political background, upbringing, experiences. Many people, it's not a red or blue thing. They have experiences in certain spaces that others won't, whether it's abortion, whether it's immigration, whatever it is. And until we ask questions and try to learn and understand, it's very hard. I think that's where politics gets us tripped up, because we make all of these assumptions. And if we go to understand, well, tell me more about, what led you to, why is this important to you? Because if important to you, it's important to me. So tell me more about why gay rights matter, or why abortion matters, or why climate change matters, because you never know what their story is. And at Thanksgiving, especially, in the book, I talk about how this daughter and father would place bets that whoever yelled first about politics then had to read all of the political arguments that the other person was going to send them for the next year until Thanksgiving again. Right? And so, which I love, I think that's hilarious. But it was so they could learn. And then the people at the table would kind of find the game funny, but then they would also get fed up. So they'd set a time where they'd say, okay, after Thanksgiving dinner, whoever wants to talk politics, the 2 of us or 3 of us will go into another room and we'll just talk through things, and we'll each take turns. So it's very mediated, right? We'll each take turns. They set up rules. They put those in place so that they can, you get a minute, then you get a minute, then I get a minute, and they keep going around. Things that are best practices to help people just share information so you don't start yelling. But yeah, Thanksgiving is always an interesting one, and definitely one where you should feel free to say, okay, this is really great, and I'm going to go get some more chocolate pie, right? Yeah. Whatever the dessert is. So.
And by the way, I don't hear you better when you yell. I actually hear you less better when you yell.
Right.
Then I just hear the noise and the message is gone.
Yes.
Some people know that, but a lot of people don't really get that very much.
No.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion are very hot topics now. But it seems that those words have varied meanings in conversation. So how do you get everyone on the same page, or is that just an unrealistic expectation? People can share their beliefs, but actually having people buy in, I think, goes I think people sometimes expect it, but I think it's not a realistic expectation.
I'm always optimistic about things, which has its own downside. Where I tend to start is if we start with an issue, people have lots of baggage already. So a lot of times starting with values and getting to know each other first. So, do you value trust, honesty, integrity, transparency? What are some of the most important moments in your life and why? Right? If we're going to have a difficult conversation, we do have to feel safe, psychologically safe, that we're not going to come to harm. And we also have to get to know, like, and trust the other person because we might share more. So starting with values, whether it's family values and you're talking amongst your, 5 generations in the household and you're all talking about DE&I differently because it didn't exist as a concept, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I think it's very important to start with values and then start to talk about real examples. So what I also find is that for many white males that I talk to about sexual harassment, they've not experienced it. Even my husband and my 2 children. Let's just start with my family. I've experienced it. And they're like, what? I'm like, yeah, it's actually a thing, right? It happens. And it's not that they just have never done that or experienced it. And so their perspective of that topic is different. Growing up in the South, different experiences when it comes to race. And so I think understanding people's background in an area is important. I also think if you're open to it, go and do research together and talk through and learn together so that it's not adversarial. It's, hey, what can we go learn? Especially if you don't know much about the topic. A lot of people think they know a lot, right? And then the challenge is when you use facts, people double down on their beliefs, even if the facts are not on their side. That's where that identity piece comes in too. So that's the other thing. If you're at Thanksgiving or if you're at a dining table with anybody and you start spewing facts like, well, this many millions of people will be impacted by climate change by ... et cetera, et cetera. If people genuinely don't believe in climate change and they don't want to be proved wrong, because if they're wrong, what does that say about them? Nobody wants to confront that identity crisis. And so that's something that's, I think, important. How do you let someone still be a human, not argue over their heads or treat them like they're just an obstacle? But that's a tricky one, right? That's a hard one. And D&I, again, until you hear people's stories who've experienced exclusion, who've experienced challenges, it's hard for people to understand what they face and how we can help also.
Yes. And those are such personal situations that people get into. And maybe some of them are alike, but they're not the same. They're definitely different.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
well, with families, many of my clients have to have those difficult conversations of telling a spouse or children about the family structure changing. And you've made some mention of this. Are there any particular lead-ins or tactics you recommend for the conversations to go smoothly other than what you've already raised?
I think what I've experienced is children are very resilient. Even sharing things with my kids, I'll sit down with them one at a time and I'll let them know that, one, they're safe, right? I want to have a difficult conversation with you. There are some things I need to make sure you know, and I'm here for you, and I'm here to support you, and we'll get through this. And it's also okay to just share one thing. So I think sometimes people feel like, well, I'm sharing this, like we're getting a divorce, but maybe don't share we're getting divorced, which means we're moving across the country, which means we're leaving all your friends. That's a lot to take in one conversation. And sometimes we might want to space those out and just not rip the Band-Aid off. And maybe with some kids that's okay. But in my experience, it's okay to just do baby steps and see how they're handling, how they're dealing with it, especially if you haven't finalized everything, right? Kids don't need to know all the different bad things or changes. They may not be bad, but changes that might happen. I mean, in your experience, what do you recommend?
What I tell parents all the time is that in my world, my belief system as a family law attorney, unless there's a serious problem with a parent, no child should lose a parent because of divorce. They had to in the beginning. It's not their fault there's a divorce happening. They should have to when we're done with this process. And just be very clear with the children and repeat this as much as it's relevant or possible to do. We both love you. You may be mad as heck at that spouse right now. We both love you and want what's best for you. And we're working on it. We're working on figuring out what that looks like, because usually, it takes a while to get these things done. And just give them some comfort. Nobody's going to go away.
Right.
And that is something that works for them, because every child now has a friend who's got divorced parents. And so it's kind of like talking to the neighbor over the fence about, how should I go about buying this piece of real estate? Well, I heard that you never get to see, the other parent once the divorce happens. No, not in this day and age at all. And only if there were extraordinary circumstances. So they have built-in fears based on things that they've heard and learned that they can share with you, that you can debunk for them and get them into a comfortable place. But they've got to be open to doing that. So, if they had a close friend who recently had their parents divorced, you might say, I know that Amy just went through this, and that I'm sure that was very hard for her. Do you have any questions that I can help answer for you that you're concerned about right now? And give the children the opportunity to have a voice. They are part of the family, and adult decisions are going to be made, but they're going to impact the children. And the children will be more, their grades will not drop as much, if at all. They'll have a sense of security. And that's what we want children to have, is a sense of security. If they don't have that, they can crumble. And I think that is in large part the responsibility of the parents to make sure that that doesn't happen, or get them in with a counselor quickly if, we're at that level of concern. It's not an uncommon thing to need some help. I mean, if you broke your arm, you would go to an orthopedist and you'd get it set. You wouldn't try to fix it yourself. Same thing's true with mental health and getting some help and guidance. It's a difficult process. And so even on its best day, they're seeing and feeling the changes. And so we have to be open to talking with them about that. That would be my recommendation. And that is what I tell people. So.
Well, I think too, just a couple of final thoughts. I think being really clear on your intentions. If you're having a conversation because you genuinely want to move people forward, I think that's helpful. Sometimes, as I said earlier, make sure it's your conversation to have. The other piece I would say is, and I think this is, I'm sure, extremely true in your field and your space, be open to acknowledging how you may have contributed to the fact that you're having to have a difficult conversation, right? Because we each play a role in it. It's not like someone's perfect and the other person's not perfect. And so I do think being open-minded to, what am I doing that's contributing to this being hard? How can I make it better? When my father got remarried, I'm very thoughtful about what I say in front of my children, because I don't want their relationship to be impacted. I want them to, have the same views of him as they did before, because he is wonderful. So I keep those conversations separate, right? I have different conversations with my husband than I might with my children. But I do think it's also important to say, hey, what could I have done differently? What could I have done better? Difficult conversations, I would practice talking about your favorite TV show and then debate it, right? We need to practice small and then start getting bigger. It's hard to have a difficult conversation right out of the gate if you haven't had one in a long time, where you just have to listen. So the framework I use is, if I know it's going to be difficult, I might just go and listen and learn. If I'm in a place where I think they want my feedback, and sometimes I'll ask because sometimes people just want to vent, then I'll share. If sharing seems to be okay, then I'll ask if they want to collaborate or problem solve together. And we might start down that path and maybe we get frustrated again. And so then I'll go back to listening. So I think it's important to remember we have these choices, even though sometimes in a difficult conversation, it may feel like we don't. We really do. We can take a breath, as you said. We can exit the conversation. We don't have to say anything, even if saying something might make you feel better in the moment. If it doesn't serve anybody in the long run, just take a deep breath and listen, right? We don't have to say everything. Even if we think it needs to be said, it actually may not. We may need it to be said, but our audience, it may not serve our relationship any. So I think just remembering that priority, that the relationship is the most important, hopefully. The difficult conversation, you can come back to at any point, but if you sever a relationship, that is extremely hard to bring back.
Yes, yes. An old saying that I repeat on a pretty regular basis is, if you are talking, you are not learning. You need to be listening to learn. And we are often seeking to gain knowledge and information. So the person who's talking too much might need to settle down just a bit.
I love that. And that is why I named my book Listen. I didn't name it Difficult Conversations because there's already one. There's plenty of difficult conversation type titles. For me, the first skill I continue to practice every day is just listen.
Well, please subscribe to our podcast channel so you never miss an episode. You can also visit our website at reeselawoffice.com. You can contact Jen Dalton at her office, 703-898-8691, or at BrandMirror.com, with a website robust with information. And there's also Jen Dalton at BrandMirror.com to reach out to her via email. I have a copy of the book here. It's well used. But there you go. So I highly recommend this. I have had people borrow it, which is why it looks like this. But it's a good read, and the topics are just amazing. So I think you'll enjoy reading it as well as benefit from it.